This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you Episode 5 of Season 4 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Westford Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, February 4th, 1911, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Harvey W. Tarbell, who recently bought of Sherman H. Fletcher an orchard on Boston Road, plans to do some renovating according to approved methods of modern orcharding. Gordon Seavey, who was age 5, and Walter Perkins, reported ill with pneumonia last week, are convalescing nicely. The next meeting of the Tadmont Club will be in Library Hall on next Tuesday afternoon at 2:30. Mrs. Herbert V. Hildreth is chairman of the afternoon's program and has arranged for Miss Grace Lawrence of Ford's Village to give a paper on California. This subject comes under the season's special topic for study of Spanish North America. Mrs. Julian A. Cameron was among those present and assisted in entertaining at a luncheon of Smith College alumni at Spalding House, Lowell, on Monday. Mrs. William L. Woods is very seriously ill at her home, suffering with pneumonia. 14 patrons from Westford Grange attended the 20th anniversary exercises at Littleton Grange on Wednesday evening and report a most enjoyable time. At the Farmers Institute Monday, none enjoyed the day more than Samuel Hosmer of Lowell, who was well past his 80th birthday. He was a visitor at the home of his niece, Mrs. W. M. Wright. Including the school children, about 300 fares were collected on our branch line the day of the Institute. We'll hear more about the Institute, the Farmers Institute, shortly. The next section is called Annual Meeting. The annual meeting of the Westford Water Company was held on Saturday, January 28th, at the home of Julian Cameron. The annual report was read and accepted. The following directors were elected: George Day, Charles Prescott, Julian Cameron, John Abbott, and Captain S.H. Fletcher. Charles Prescott, clerk and treasurer, and Charles Kellogg of Boston, auditor. The directors organized and elected George Day, president, Captain Sherman H. Fletcher, manager, and Alonzo Sutherland, superintendent and engineer. Business for the ensuing year was discussed with plans of probable further expansion. The company is on a firm basis financially, and the total expenditure for installing the supply has been $84,000. The wisdom of installing this water supply has fully been proven. The dry seasons the past 2 or 3 years would have caused the greatest inconvenience and suffering. The next couple paragraphs are on the Village Improvement Meeting. The Westford Improvement Association, having been moribund for 10 years, and as some of our leading citizens recognizing need of some organization to look out in a broad way for the welfare of the town, a meeting was held in Town Hall on Tuesday evening when about 25 of our citizens were present. Being called to order by Sherman H. Fletcher, Edward Fisher was chosen chairman and Charles O. Prescott temporary secretary. After brief speeches, Mr. Fletcher and Mr. Fisher, Fletcher and Mr. Fisher, followed by a general discussion, a committee of 5 retired and nominated George Day, Charles L. Hildreth, John C. Abbott, Charles Prescott, and Leonard Wheeler as a committee to investigate and report as to name, purposes, and bylaws for the proposed organization. This committee was promptly elected and adjournment was made to Thursday, February 9th, when this committee is to report. The next section is titled Teachers Social. The Teachers Social, which has become one of the established events in the social calendar of the Congregational Church, took place last Friday evening at the vestry. The stormy weather made a difference in attendance, but fully 75 were present and felt repaid for coming out with a good social time. A pleasing entertainment, and dainty refreshments. The entertainment consisted of shadow pictures representing scenes from Mother Goose and, quote, a story in black and white, end quote. The pictures were very cleverly arranged and proved most enjoyable. The program was supplemented with musical numbers as follows: violin solos, Reverend David Wallace; vocal solos, Miss Edith Pond; and piano solo by Miss Hazel Hartford. Refreshments were served at the close of the program, consisting of assorted cake, chocolate, and whipped cream. Miss Edith Lawrence, Miss Bertha Norris, Miss Winifred Burnham, Miss Martha Grant, Miss Edith Pond, and Miss Martha Crocker had charge of the social. The committee for the social for February have organized and are actively at work with preparations for a novel entertainment. At the gathering on Friday evening, admission was according to height, 3 cents per foot, and for each fraction thereof. Henry Colburn attended to the measuring most capably. About town. The next meeting of the Fortnightly Club will be held at the Wright Schoolhouse Friday evening, February 10th, at which time and place a debate has been arranged between DeLacy Corkum of Billerica and anyone who is willing to step into the ring and come the short jab, the left and right swing on him on the question, resolved that the influence of home is greater on character than the influence of society. In the event of either or both receiving a knockout, there will be an abundance of reserves to protect a sure good time. Mrs. Clara Littlefield of Fitchburg, an old-time scholar and teacher at the Stony Brook School, attended the Institute on Monday and gathered in the welcome hospitality of the old Walker homestead, where resides her sister, Miss Belle Walker, and a brother, Charles E. Walker. That was out Main Street, towards the east side of town. Daniel H. Sheehan has a contract for sawing 400,000 feet of lumber for Captain Wilson in Carlisle. When this is finished, he has a contract with Daniel H. Sheehan for making 2 pressings of cider, the apples being at present in frozen cold storage at his mill on Tadmuck Brook. The remains of this mill are still evident today, and you can walk, makes a nice little hike off of Lowell Road to visit it. The handsome display of flowers at the funeral of John H. Decatur was by his request donated to hospitals in Lowell, a wise and conserving last will. The next section is on the Farmers Institute that was mentioned earlier. The largest and most enthusiastic Farmers Institute ever held in Westford was held here on Monday under the management of Middlesex North Agricultural Society. Howard Foster of Tewksbury presided and introduced Reverend David Wallace to give the address of welcome, which was done with the thought and spirit that made each person feel that they were the person desired to be present. Owing to the sudden illness of his wife, Charles A. Kimball of Littleton was absent, he being listed to respond, his duty being performed by Henry A. Smith of Lowell. In his response, he noted the scarcity of young new orchards and the untrimmed viewpoint of others. With these conditions, he thought the subject of the day appropriate, and Middlesex North was glad and fortunate to be present. Owing to the illness of Professor Sears, his place was supplied by Professor Frank A. Waugh, W-A-U-G-H, of the State College at Amherst, what we know as UMass Amherst. As an owner of several thousand trees, he proved more than a theorist in dealing with the subject of apple orcharding. A few of the condensed points were set out 1 year old trees in preference to those 2 years old. In 3 years, they will be larger. Cut the top down to 18 inches from the ground to secure low branching trees. Gravel subsoil will produce a better quality of apples and better keeping. Should not be planted deeper than the bud from which the tree started, in a hole no larger than the roots require, which should be trimmed of the superfluous and mangled. Set Baldwin trees about 40 feet apart and plant fillers of early bearing varieties, leaving the trees about 15 or 20 feet apart. keep the land cultivated, and plow in buckwheat and beans for runners and moisture. When the Baldwin need the room, remove the fillers. For varieties, plant Baldwin, McIntosh, Red, and Wealthy. Admitted that apples grown on sod ground were better colored and keep better, but this was offset by greater yield on cultivated ground. Advocated thinning fruit, scraping old trees, and pruning in summer or late winter. Prefers southern-grown stock to northern, having farmed in the West, Massachusetts, and Vermont, claims those more hardy and vigorous. Never buys of agents, but direct from the nursery, calling for bids, and never had cause to complain. Feeds the trees on chemicals, home mixed, which tends to a better keeping apple than the barnyard compost producers. There's evidently a lot to know about orcharding. At the noon hour, 250 sat down to one of the Westford's old-time plenty-to-eat dinners, which was arranged by Westford Grange under the direction of the ladies' degree team. The Grange Orchestra, Arthur T. Blodgett leader, played during all of the dinner hour, those lively, spirited selections that helped digestion and made dyspepsia hustle to find its tenants. Among those who dispensed to hunger were Mrs. Henry Colburn, Mrs. Josephine Prescott, Mrs. Alonzo Sutherland, Mrs. L.M. Gould, Mrs. Leonard Wheeler, Mrs. Ida Whitney, Mrs. Charles Robinson, Mrs. D.L. McLeod, Mrs. Mary Moran, Grace Robinson, May Boynton, Mrs. David Grieg, Mrs. Pearlie Wright, Miss Lucinda Prescott, Mrs. John McMaster, Mrs. E.M. Wright, and Mrs. Samuel Taylor. The after-dinner exercises included a talk by the Honorable Frank A. Patch of Littleton, who spoke on the subject, Village Improvement, What Next? And from his observation, the what next should be in the line of lessening the tendency towards a mild form of village rowdyism. Professor Wall closed the exercises with humorous anecdotes that got the audience into a happy, receptive mood for his closing remarks on orcharding. The next section is the Graniteville section. Cameron Circle held a class initiation at their hall on Tuesday night, January 24th. 33 members were initiated. Grand Chief Companion Mrs. Julia McCarty of Lynn presided at the meeting and initiated the new members and was ably assisted by Grand Past Chief Companion Mrs. Bertha Crittenden of Springfield. The grand officers were guests of Mrs. Julia Wall. A son, Donald Joseph Reeves, was welcomed to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Albert Reeves on Saturday, January 28th. According to the Westford Vital Records, it was January 27th, but the paper has January 28th. Little Regina McClenna, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Lester M. McClenna, fell and splintered her collarbone last week. On Saturday evening, a very enjoyable dancing party was held in Healy's Hall for the benefit of a young man who is ill. Quite a neat sum was realized. The party was in charge of the young ladies of this village, who have been doing all they can to help the young man by subscriptions and other means, and certainly deserve great credit for such charitable work. Mrs. Julia B. Wall attended an executive council meeting of the C of F of A, that's the Companions of Foresters of America, which was held in Worcester on January 31st. Miss Hulda Carlson of West Chelmsford has returned home after a brief stay with friends in this village. The next paragraphs are about a death. Miss Catherine G. Harrington, a well-known and highly respected young woman of this village, died at the home of her brother, P. Henry Harrington, Friday morning, January 27th. After a lingering illness, which she bore with great patience and Christian fortitude, she was 32 years old. The deceased was well known and favorably known, having lived here practically all her life, with the exception of a short time when she resided in Leominster. Katie, as she was familiarly called by her many friends, was a lovable young woman who always looked on the bright side of life and had a sweet smile for everybody. She never gave up hope and almost to the end believed that she would rally from her illness. Everything that a loving brother and sisters and affectionate relatives could do to alleviate her suffering was done. Both Reverend Schofield and Reverend Doherty of St. Catherine's Church attended to her spiritual needs, the latter clergyman being with her until a short time before she passed away. She lived a good life, pure life, and was rewarded by a peaceful end. She leaves one brother, P. Henry Harrington, and three sisters, Mrs. H. J. Healy, Miss Mary A. Harrington of this village, and Miss Anna Harrington of Leominster, as well as many relatives and friends in Lowell, Fitchburg, and Leominster. The sympathy of the village is extended to the bereaved family in this sad hour. The funeral of Miss Harrington took place from the home of her brother, P. Henry Harrington, at 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. The bearers were R.J. McCarty, Harry Quinn, Florence Sullivan, Maurice Quinlan, Edward Riney, and Frank Charlton. Burial was in St. Catherine's Cemetery. A high mass of requiem was celebrated in Healy's Hall on Monday morning by Reverend Doherty. Miss May Hanley presided at the organ. Next, we have the Forge Village section. The many friends of Frederick Davis are pleased to learn he is able to be at work again after an illness of 2 weeks. Mrs. Harriet E. Randall, who has been confined to her home the past week with a severe cold, is improving, and Mrs. Lucretia Reed also has improved from her recent illness. The infant daughter, born January 25th, of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Bourassa, was christened Marie Clara Maria at the parish house of St. John's Church on last Sunday. Miss Emily Catchpole and her brother, John W. Catchpole, were guests last Sunday of their sister, Annie, and brother-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Mason of Lowell. The services tomorrow in Abbott Hall will be in charge of Reverend Edmund T. Schofield, pastor. The Ladies' Sewing Circle held a very interesting meeting on Wednesday afternoon at the home of its president, Mrs. Richard Prescott. Little Miss Nellie Parrott, a pupil in Miss Abby M. Blaisdell's room in Cameron School, has the distinction of bringing the first spring flower of the year. Last week she gathered some pussy willows, which have since adorned the classroom. The ice houses of the Daniel Gage Ice Company are now filled, the work being completed last Sunday. Mrs. Charles Blodgett, Mrs. Chester Blodgett, and Mrs. William Blodgett and children were guests on Tuesday of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Mason of Lowell. Mr. and Mrs. John Morton of Lowell and father, Mr. Northrop, visited at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Fenimore Morton last Sunday. The Girls Friendly Society held its regular meeting in Recreation Hall on Wednesday evening. After the meeting, a musicale was held, which was very much enjoyed by all the members. The program follows: song, Only One Daisy Left, Miss Bertha Wilson; recitation, Miss Annie Cherry; piano solo, Miss Edith Spencer; song, Miss Rachel Cherry; recitation, Miss Annie Orr; piano solo, Marion Blodgett; recitation, Miss Nellie Orr. The young ladies have charge of the entertainment, with a Mrs. Elizabeth Spinner, Bertha Wilson, Nellie Orr, and Marion Blodgett. That's the news in Westford for the week ending February 4th, 1911. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.